Alright, I'm going to show you how easy it is to set up a WireGuard network using the web UI from Pro Custodibus. And I'm going to assume that you've already followed the Pro Custodibus Getting Started tutorial, which shows you how to register a new account on Pro Custodibus and how to set up your first host with the Pro Custodibus agent. So let's say that this first host that we've deployed the agent on is a VPN server that's going to provide access to a cloud site from the internet, and we want to connect my laptop and my phone to the VPN server so that the VPN server can provide access to the internal resources at this cloud site. Like, say we've got some web applications, databases, whatever, at this cloud site that I want to be able to access from my laptop and phone. So it's the classic point-to-site scenario where this VPN server provides access to the site from the points, my phone and my laptop. So we're going to, number one, use the Pro Custodibus web UI to configure the VPN server, the site, and my laptop and phone, the points. Then number two, watch the Pro Custodibus agent push the configuration to the VPN server automatically. Number three, install the Pro Custodibus agent on my laptop and watch it automatically configure WireGuard on my laptop. And number four, snap a QR code to automatically configure my phone for this WireGuard network. So let's first open up the VPN server in our Pro Custodibus UI. You can see I've already installed the Pro Custodibus agent on it, but I don't have any WireGuard interfaces configured. Now keep in mind that a WireGuard interface is a virtual network interface by which a host, like our VPN server here, can connect to other remote hosts over the WireGuard protocol. So from the perspective of a host, a WireGuard interface is the local side of its connection to a WireGuard network. So the first thing I need to do to configure this VPN server is create a new WireGuard interface for it. So in this interfaces panel, I'm going to click the add icon here, and that opens up an add interface page. And I'm going to name the interface WG0. I could give it a more meaningful name, but keep in mind that this interface name is used internally by the host's own network stack as an identifier for the interface. So usually I just want to keep it pretty short and simple, so I'm just going to use sort of the standard WG0 name here. And for this next field, description, I can enter a more full description of what this interface does. So I can say access to internal cloud. For peer, this is going to be the peer identity of the interface itself. And I don't have any peers registered yet with Pro Custodibus, so I'll click New to create a new peer identity. And I'm just going to call it VPN server as the name. And for public key, I could generate a public key pair offline and enter it in manually into this form, but I'll just let Pro Custodibus generate it for me by clicking this generate button. So that's a new random public key pair, and I'll click add to register that peer. And so for the next field I need to fill out here is going to be the port that this interface listens on, and I'll use the standard WireGuard port of 51820, and I don't need firewall mark. That's just an advanced sort of field. For addresses, this will be the IP address of this peer within our WireGuard network, so I can make it any address I want. I can set it to an IPv4 address or a v6 address or a couple of both. But for this scenario, I'm just going to use a simple IPv4 address, just going to give it 10.0.0.1. And for DNS servers, if I had an internal DNS server that I wanted this host to use when the WireGuard interface was up, I could put in the IP address of that DNS server in this field. But I don't for this scenario, so I'm just going to leave it blank. Same thing with search domains. If I did have a custom DNS server and a custom internal search domain, like .corp, then I would put corp in this search domains field, but I don't have any for this scenario, so I'm going to leave it blank. Same with MTU. I'm going to leave it blank and let WireGuard figure out the best MTU to use for this interface. And same with table. That's another advanced field that I can just skip. For this next set of fields, the scripts, these are also advanced fields that you usually don't need to use, but in this case, for the point to site scenario on the VPN server here, we do need some particular firewall rules, and in some cases you may choose to just set up the firewall rules and other settings in other places on the server, but for this simple version of the scenario, it's convenient just to set them up in this pre-up script, and so that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to copy over a couple rules here and paste them in here that will enable my VPN server to forward packets and masquerade those packets when it forwards them into our cloud site. If you want to know the details of this, check out our point to site blog post at procustodibus.com that has some of the gory details. Let me just copy these two rules and paste them into the down script as well, and tear down these rules when the interface goes down. So that's what I need to configure this interface on the VPN server. So I'll click the add button to queue the changes here. And while we wait for the agent to deploy those changes, I'm going to go ahead and create two endpoints for this new interface. These endpoints will be the two peers of this interface that can connect to it, one for my laptop and one for my phone. And these endpoints sort of represent the remote side of the VPN server's connection to the WireGuard network. They define what peers this VPN server can connect to and how the server goes about making the connection. So if you're familiar with the standard WireGuard configuration format, what goes in the sections of a WireGuard config file that are labeled peer is what you'd put into the endpoint configuration on Pro Custodibus. So on Pro Custodibus, we try to use peer to refer to the global identity of a node within a WireGuard network, and use endpoint to refer to a specific connection to that peer. So, for example, two hosts may know the same peer by its public key, but will have different configuration settings to access that peer. Like the two hosts might have different IP addresses for that same peer, or might have different pre-shared keys for that peer. So, I'm going to register a new endpoint here by clicking the add icon in that endpoints panel. And on this add endpoint page, the first thing I need to do is select a peer identity for this remote endpoint. And so I don't have any other peers defined yet, so I'm going to create a peer identity for my laptop by clicking the new button. And for name, I'm going to just call it Justin's laptop. And again, I could copy in a public key pair that I generated offline, but instead I'm just going to let Pro Custodibus generate a new unique key pair for me and register it here. And now I've got that set up as the peer for this endpoint, and for the host name I can leave that blank, port I can leave that blank, persistent keep alive, don't need that in this case, pre-shared key, I don't need that either. WireGuard is perfectly secure without a pre-shared key, but it's easy enough to add one through the Pro Custodibus UI, so I'm going to have it generate just another random key for me here. And for my laptop, I'm going to set the IP address of my laptop within this WireGuard network as 10.00.2. So for the allowed IPs setting on my VPN server to connect to my laptop, I'm going to use that 10.00.2 IP address. So this setting allowed IPs to 10.00.2 in this configuration will tell my VPN server here that it should send all traffic for 10.00.2 out this endpoint to my laptop. So that's what I need for this configuration here. So I'll click add to add this endpoint to queue it for creation. And now let me go back to the interface here. This VPN servers WireGuard interface. We've got the update pending to create to set up the endpoint on my VPN server that would connect to my laptop. Now I'm going to do the same thing for my phone. I'm going to go ahead and create a new peer here for Justin's phone and generate a public key pair. Register that again. Don't need to specify host name, don't need to specify port, don't need to specify keep alive, don't actually need a pre-shared key, but I'm going to generate one anyway. And I'm going to use an IP address of 10.00.3 for my phone within this WireGuard network. So I'll click the add button and queue that for creation. So if we go back to the WireGuard interface for my VPN server here, you can see that so far it's pushed the basic interface configuration to the VPN server, hasn't yet pushed the configuration for my laptop and phone, which is fine. I'll do that in a minute or two. While that is pending, let's go ahead and set up the WireGuard interface for my laptop. So let's go and over to the host list here and create a new host for my laptop by clicking the add icon in the host panel. And so I'm just going to call this host Justin's laptop and add that, and I'm going to wait a second on actually deploying the agent to my laptop. I'll do that later after I've set up the WireGuard interface on the laptop will use. And so for right now, I'm going to go to the main page for my laptop here, and just like we did for the VPN server, I'm going to create a new WireGuard interface for my laptop. And just like I did for the VPN server, I'm just going to name it that standard name of WG0. The description, I'll give it a more descriptive name, like connection to our internal cloud. And for peer, remember I already registered a peer for my laptop when I created the endpoint for it on the VPN server's interface. So I'll use that peer identity here for the interface on my laptop. And for port, I can, in this case, skip it and let WireGuard just select some free port on my laptop whenever it starts up this interface. The only field I actually need to fill in here is addresses. So you saw a minute ago when I set up the endpoint for my laptop on the VPN server, I said I was going to use an IP address of 10.00.2 for my laptop. So that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to put into this field. I'm going to put in the IP address that my laptop will use to identify itself within the WireGuard network. And I can skip all these other fields and just click the add button here to queue up a change to create this interface. And when we deploy the Pro Custodibus agent to my laptop, that's when that change will be executed. But first, the one other configuration setting I need to make is I need to create an endpoint for this interface on my laptop to be able to connect to the VPN server. So this will sort of complete the loop where a couple minutes ago I just set up that local interface for my VPN server and set up an endpoint on the VPN server that allows it to connect remotely to my laptop. Now I've just created this local interface for my laptop, and now we're going to create an endpoint on that interface that allows it to connect to the VPN server. So I'm going to click the add icon here on this endpoints panel, and that takes me to the add endpoint page, and I want to connect to the VPN server from my laptop. So I'm going to select that as the peer, and you can see that Pro Custodibus has automatically filled in a couple fields for me when I select that. One field I do need to set here is the public IP address of the VPN server, and I'm going to enter that right now. It happens to be 18.237.177.185, and if I had set up a DNS entry for this VPN server, excuse me, I would use the DNS name for that instead of IP address, but I just have an IP address, so I enter it here. Pro Custodibus remembered that when I set up the WireGuard interface on my VPN server, I said listen on port 51820, so that's what I need this endpoint to connect to. I don't need persistent keep alive in this scenario. You can see that Pro Custodibus also remembered that when I set up the endpoint on my VPN server to my laptop, that I created a pre-shared key. So Pro Custodibus is going to use that same pre-shared key for the sort of corresponding endpoint on my laptop to make sure that it can successfully connect to the VPN server using that same pre-shared key. And for allowed IPs, Pro Custodibus also remembered that I had set the address of that VPN server interface to 10.00.1, so that's what it suggests for me here. However, in this case, with a point-to-site scenario, I actually don't want to connect necessarily to the VPN server itself through WireGuard. What I really want is to use this WireGuard tunnel to go through the VPN server and connect to the hosts in in the site that the VPN server is part of. And so in that case, it happens to be all these internal apps that I want to connect to through WireGuard, through the VPN server, are part of this 10.90 block. So that's what I'm going to enter here. And actually, because I have no use for connecting directly through WireGuard to the VPN server, I'm just going to remove that 10.0.0.1 entry and just say, use 10.90 as the allowed IPs for this endpoint, which tells my laptop that whenever I want to reach something in this 10.90 block, it needs to send all that traffic through this WireGuard interface on my laptop. So I'm going to click the add button to queue this endpoint for creation. And so now we've got this pending configuration set up here on my laptop that will enable it to connect to the VPN server. So to apply it to my laptop, I've got to go and install the Pro Custodibus agent on my laptop. So I'll go back to the host page for my laptop and go into the setup agent link, and that takes me to the setup page for this host, where I need to download the Pro Custodibus configuration file for this host, as well as the setup key. And so now I'm going to go set up the agent on my laptop. So first I think I need to install WireGuard here. So I'll let it do its thing for a minute, and alright, that took a little while, but now let's move those two comp files, etc WireGuard, and alright, filter. And let's see, let's download the agent. And download the signature file, and just verify that real quick. Signature first, tarball second, good signature. So we'll untar tarball here, and we'll go ahead and install the agent. While that's happening, if you want to go a little more in depth about what's going on here, check out the setting up, getting started with Pro Custodibus tutorial that will kind of go through all the details of installing the agent, the Pro Custodibus agent on host. Alright, thank you for installing, and so let's just double check that everything's running okay. That looks good. So run sudo wd show, should see that we've got our interface that we It's configured a few minutes ago for my laptop, is up and running with the public key pair that we generated for it, and it's got one endpoint configured, the endpoint to my VPN server here at that particular IP address that we configured, and anything in the 10.90 range should be sent through this WireGuard tunnel to my internal cloud site, and we can test that out. Try to access one of our internal web apps here with curl, just as a quick test. I think it should be at 189. Should see, excuse me. Should see something. Yeah, awesome. So we have access to our local site through WireGuard here on my laptop. And if I go back to Pro Custodibus, take a look at the Pro Custodibus dashboard, I should see that we have some access here sent from my laptop to my VPN server. So for the last bit of setup, let's go ahead and configure my phone the same way that we did my laptop. So let's go back to our host list here and create one more host for my phone. And I'm actually not going to install the agent on my phone. Instead, I'm going to set up the configuration for my phone here in the Pro Custodibus UI, and then snap a QR code of that configuration to get that config onto my phone. So I'm going to skip this agent setup business and just go directly to the main host page for my phone here, and in the interfaces panel, just like we did for the VPN server and for my laptop, I'm going to click the add icon to add an interface for my phone, and I'm just going to call it WG0 like it did for these other interfaces, and I'm going to give it a description, connection to our internal cloud, just like I did for my laptop. For peer, we already created a peer identity for my phone when we set up the VPN server, so I'm going to use that peer identity. I don't need to specify port or firewall mark. The only other field I need to enter is the addresses field, and I need to enter into it the IP address that I'm going to use for this phone within the WireGuard network. And so if you remember, I said I would use the 10.0.3 IP address for my phone when I set up the configuration for my VPN server. So that's what I'll use here, and I don't need to fill in anything else. Just going to click the add button to create this interface in Pro Custodibus, and then the last step is to set up an endpoint for my phone to connect to the VPN server. So just like we did on my laptop, I'm going to select the VPN server as the peer for this endpoint. And Pro Custodibus remembers that I used this IP address when I set up a similar endpoint on my laptop to connect to the VPN server. So that's what it suggests, that's what I want. Same thing with port, that's what I used last time, that's what I want here. And it also remembered for allowed IPs, it's the same IP block that I said I wanted on my laptop, well, I also want that for same setting on my phone, and so that's what Pro Custodibus has suggested. And remember, when we set up the endpoint on the VPN server to connect to this phone, that we also generated a new unique pre-shared key for that connection. I need to use that same key on this end of the connection too for the connection to be set up successfully. Pro Custodibus remembers that and is going to use that when I create the endpoint here. So I've set up the endpoint here for the interface on my phone, and now I just need to be able to get this configuration that I've set up to my phone. So I'm going to go back to the interfaces page here on Pro Custodibus, and I'm going to go click the download configuration icon that looks like a QR code in this interface panel to go to the download configuration page for this interface that we just set up for my phone. And you can see that on this page it displays a QR code that I can use to set up my phone, or I could also manually enter in these settings or download them for future reference, or I could also download this QR code if I wanted to, save that image and use it later, or if I was setting up the configuration for a colleague's phone instead of my own phone, I could save this image and send it securely to that colleague for her to snap on for her phone. So let me get out my phone and open up the WireGuard app and snap this QR code here real quick. Alright, and one other thing I should point out here is that if we go back here, you can see that we have the private key for this interface listed out here, as well as the pre-shared key for its connection with the VPN server. So it's really important that if you download this file or copy its contents, that you keep the content secret. So you'd want to encrypt it if you were going to send it to somebody, or otherwise use some secure channel to transmit it. And the same thing goes for the QR code, that it's got the private key for this interface embedded in it. So if you do save it and transmit it over email or some other messaging system, make sure you encrypt that file or use some secure messaging channel that you know is 100% secure for it. So I'm just going to real quick access one of our internal web applications in our cloud site here for my phone. So now if we go back to the dashboard, we should see that we do have some activity here from my phone. And note that because the Pro Custodibus agent isn't installed on my phone, Pro Custodibus won't actively monitor my phone, so we won't see any information about the host for the phone. We'll just see it, so we won't see any information on this particular chart that shows details about the hosts that I have monitored in Pro Custodibus, but we will see activity from my phone in this chart that shows the various peers within this WireGuard network that have some activity that's been captured. And also, if you go to the host page for my phone, you'll see that the queue changes for the phone won't ever actually be marked as applied. They'll always be listed as pending. That's because I applied them manually when I snapped the QR code for that configuration. But Pro Custodibus can't see that, so all it will see is the activity on the VPN server that I do have monitored. It'll only be able to see that activity from the phone to the server on the VPN server. So even though Pro Custodibus isn't actively monitoring my phone, we can still see that traffic captured by the agent on my server. So that's what I wanted to show you today, how quickly and easily you can set up a simple point-to-site WireGuard network using the Pro Custodibus UI.